It is timely to remember that 50 years ago, South Australia did lead the way in being the first jurisdiction in Australia in decriminalising male homosexuality. But that came about through, as often things do, through a terrible event, in fact, the killing of Dr. George Duncan. And with the killing of Dr. George Duncan, which we know, although it was never found so in courts, was done by the Vice Squad of the South Australian Police in what they dubbed, according to former Attorney General and the Honourable Peter Duncan in his reenactment speech, as poofter swimming lessons. And of course we know that Dr. George Duncan, as a newly arrived academic to this state, wasn't a capable swimmer and in fact died from that activity of throwing gay men into the River Torrens. What many people aren't aware of, other than the fact that the police were never held accountable for their actions that killed not just this man but harmed so many others, is that Dr. Duncan, once retrieved from the Torrens, was then thrown back in to be retrieved again for the media who arrived later that day. And we continue in our law reform to require those who are othered in our society, who are marginalised because of their identity, their sexuality, their gender, their otherness somehow, when we are all different, we continue to require them to perform and to be performative to get equality. So I reflect on the words, and I thought the most compelling contribution was that in the reenactment of the debates around the 50th anniversary of the decriminalisation of male homosexuality, was that former Attorney General Peter Duncan's contribution, which was a modern reflection. In fact, I understand he refused to rehash his old speeches from when he took leadership some 50 plus years ago, and in fact reflected on where we are now, stating in that contribution, well, this is a proud moment of reflection on a great achievement. It's not often in public life or post-public life that you're able to achieve something worthwhile and live long enough to see the successful outcomes of that reform. How lucky I am to be here today to mark 50 years since the passage of the Homosexual Reform Bill. In 50 years, South Australia led the nation, and of course now every jurisdiction has cast aside the criminal sanctions. Mr. Duncan reflected that a wise leader once said, "Ask yourself if the generation in 100 years will thank you for the decisions you make today." Well, we're halfway there, and in relation to homosexual law reform, the answer is a resounding yes. Mr. Duncan then reflected something that I have often done in this place. In fact, where we once led, we often in South Australia now lag. And he went on to say, subsequently, SA has not always led. It took 30 years before legislation to expunge homosexual convictions was passed. South Australia was the last state in the country to abolish the gay panic defence, passing reforms through the Parliament in December 2020. Hate crime laws that explicitly include sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex characteristics within South Australian sentencing legislation were passed and implemented in November 2021. And the State Parliament recently passed legislation explicitly banning gay conversion therapy. That was nearly 50 years after the pioneering legislation that this motion reflects upon and that we indeed now celebrate. I note both on hate crimes and in the abolishment of the gay panic defence, the defence for murder, where simply because somebody might be accused of being gay, in fact regardless of whether they were gay or not, and making a sexual advance that was unwanted, could somehow warrant that murder being treated as a lesser crime, is abhorrent in itself, should have been abolished far before it was, and I am proud to have played my part in ensuring not just that we now have hate crime legislation in this state in terms of sentencing, but to have led reform around rainbow parenting, marriage equality, and a number of other areas. But we have so much more to do, Mr. President. I note that during the debate on the abolition of what is now called conversion practices, rather than what used to be euphemistically called gay conversion therapy, there was homophobia in the debate that day and on those days. It was an extraordinary occurrence almost 50 years after this chamber had seen fit to ensure that homosexuality was no longer viewed as a criminal activity, that it was still derided, and that homophobic language entered that particular debate. It was a sad day, I thought, although of course we continue to progress, and that is what I shall look towards. And we do stand on the shoulders of giants in this place, of people who have been at the vanguard. And there is much talk, of course, of former Premier Dunstan. And I note also that former Attorney General Peter Duncan noted that he and former Premier had numerous discussions about his bill. And he is quoted in his contribution saying, "Don's influence in the debate was obviously of vital importance, although not necessarily in the way implied in some publications. Don's strategy of creating a coalition of electoral support from the workers, Italians, Greeks and the intelligentsia was critical. Without that support base, I think it unlikely that all Labor members of the Parliament would have been brave enough to support the measure. Given the bill's unpopularity, opinion polling at the time indicated that more than 60% were in opposition, with only 17% in favour. It's not true, however, that Don played any role in initiating the bill, as some people have suggested, and as I said, he gave it enthusiastic support once the bill had been announced and introduced. And it's often the case that people in retrospect are all happy to claim a great achievement of progress, but not necessarily willing to initiate and lead it. So I do echo the contribution of my colleague, the Honourable Robert Sims, just now, in acknowledging the work of people such as the Honourable Michelle Lensink, the Honourable Ian Hunter in this chamber, but also people like former Attorney General Vicky Chapman in her leadership in a party possibly more hostile than we currently see in this particular Parliament. I reflect also on the final contribution of former Attorney General Peter Duncan when he quoted former Prime Minister Paul Keating and his words that the reward for public life is public progress. Public progress does come at great cost often to those who lead the charge, and it is at great benefit for those who benefit from it, but it is something that is always fragile. And for 50 years on from the debate where we, as a chamber and as a parliament, decriminalised male homosexuality, for it to take them many decades to see those spent convictions, those convictions actually expunged of historic crimes, and even then for the administrative ability for those crimes to be expunged, to be limited only to family members of those then gay males who were criminalised by a much more moralistic parliament of the past, is not good enough. We can't simply rest on our laurels. South Australia must continue to lead. We should not lag, and we should have the courage and bravery in this place to stand up for those who are marginalised and othered more often, rather than waiting for the opinion polls to lead us. We as members of Parliament should be leading more often. With that, I commend the motion.